Modesty is one of the virtues to which Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication of the Rights of Women, gives a lot of attention and analysis to, in part to tell us what genuine modesty is, and also to try to wean us away from mistaken or wrong-headed conceptions of what modesty would consist in, or what it would come from, where its origins would lie. And I think this is a very important part of her work, because we still see this rhetoric of modesty used today in ways that, you know, she would criticize on the basis of being, in some ways, detrimental to women's development. So let's look at what she has to say. First off, is modesty just a feminine virtue? There are some people who presented it that way, and you can still find echoes of that in parts of today's culture, even in the talk about modesty. Sometimes there's some lip service to how men ought to be modest, but usually it's talked about in a different way. With women, it tends to focus on things like dress, or how they comport themselves in relation to, particularly to boys, to men, to those sorts of issues. And Wollstonecraft wants to say, you can call that modesty if you like, but it's not what modesty really is. Modesty, in its genuine sense, is in fact, as she says, it's not a quality but a virtue. That means it's something that has to be developed over time. It's something that develops in part by exercising your rationality, by some sort of independence that's not compatible with just following the rules or dependency. We'll see her talk at a number of points about how it's not just a matter of behaving the right way, but rather developing a quality of character, a lasting habit. When we talk about it, not just being a quality, it's got to be a quality of character that has become part of who one is, part of one's general approach to things. And Wollstonecraft thinks that modesty is just as appropriate, just as necessary for men as it is for women. So it's not a distinctively feminine virtue, although it is a virtue. And as we'll see as we come to the end of this, it's actually one of the virtues that's required for the exercise of the other virtues. So you might call it a super virtue or a meta virtue in certain respects. She goes on and she asks, well, is it then just purity of mind? She says, it appears to me proper to discriminate that purity of mind, which is the effect of chastity, the effect of not having sex, about, restraining the passions, very often not just about, not having sex, but not doing the sorts of things that lead to having sex as well. She says, that's not what modesty is really about. There are some connections there in certain respects, but it's actually something much more global. It's not just concerned with sexuality. She says, it's really a simplicity of character that leads us to form a just opinion of ourselves, equally distant from vanity or presumption. And then she goes on and says, by no means incompatible with a lofty consciousness of our own dignity. So, let's think about what that means for a minute. What is it to have a just opinion of ourselves? So that means partly putting ourselves in the proper context in relation to other people. That means that we don't think too highly of ourselves. We don't think that we're better than we actually are. We also don't think too low of ourselves, because you can be unjust or incorrect going too high or going too low. These are both equally off the mark. So, for example, I've been teaching philosophy classes now for more than a decade and a half. So I can say that I am an experienced teacher, and that I've had some successes in leading students into classic texts. Now, does that mean that I then elevate myself to the status of, well, I'm just as good as Wollstonecraft or Aristotle or Heidegger? That would be vanity. That would be presumption. Should I say, well, I'm really no better than I was when I started out 15 years ago, and I was not particularly good at teaching 15 years ago. I had to learn a lot of things in the process. No, that would be an unjust unjustly low opinion of myself. And we can do the same thing for all sorts of other characteristics, qualities. We can compare ourselves against others. Oftentimes, what she is calling modesty will consist in and will require, and this is part of why it requires mental cultivation as well as moral cultivation, you got to have enough information. You have to actually have a wide enough perspective to put things into perspective. So, you know, if you think about, well, here's a great example. Think about attractiveness. If you got all of your ideas about what an attractive person is, not from looking at people in your society or even friends and family, but looking primarily at Hollywood movies, at fashion magazines, and at advertisements, you would probably have a very distorted conception of where you fit into the scale. You know, in part because you don't have Photoshop to, you know, edit out any of your blemishes or, you know, make you look more thin, or, you know, for men actually they use it to make them look more muscular. It's funny because there's a whole you know, set of websites out there that are people catching other people doing these Photoshop things. But if all you had was that as your measure, you would not be able to have a good, just conception of your own attractiveness. We can do the same thing for wealth. We can do the same thing for you know, how easy-natured you are, how easy you are to get along with others. And then we can also talk about, you know, personal growth and where are you on the range of it, you know. A lot of people want to think that because they draw up a plan or they make a good intention that somehow they've catapulted themselves all the way to the end of the process. So, you know, I don't actually need to go to the gym. I just need to sign up for a gym membership or maybe think about exercising, and now I'm in great shape. It doesn't work like that. That would be a lack of modesty, you know. So forming a just opinion of ourselves. She also goes on and says it's compatible with lofty consciousness of our own dignity. We shouldn't think less of ourselves than we actually deserve. There are some things that we deserve because of our dignity, and that goes into modesty. So when we talk about, for example, basic human rights and the fact that nobody should deprive us of them, that's part of our dignity. And modesty insists on those. It also doesn't shrink back from great things. She also points out that it's not a product of chastity by itself. She's got some interesting discussions here. She says, to render chastity the virtue from which unsophisticated modesty will naturally flow, the attention should be called away from employments which only exercise the sensibility, and the heart made to be time to humanity rather than to throb with love. So if you want to actually cultivate modesty on the basis of chastity, what you have to do is, instead of making people just not have sex or think about other things or take cold showers or, you know, behave in a certain way towards each other, you need to expand their minds. You need to open up their ranges to other things, other human capabilities. She says, the regulation of behavior is not modesty, though those who study rules of decorum are in general termed modest women. Make the heart clean, let it expand and feel for all that is human instead of being narrowed by selfish passions, and let the mind frequently contemplate subjects which exercise the understanding, and artless modesty will give the finishing touches to the picture. So if you want to raise people who are modest, you actually need to work on their minds, not just on their behavior. Let's look now at how she arranges this virtue in relation to other character traits that she really considers vices. I do have to mention something too. When she uses the word humility and she says modesty is not humility, through the rest of the Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft is a bit inconsistent. She will use humility in such a way as to signify what she, in this chapter, is actually calling modesty. Is that, you know, a really big problem? No, just substitute the word modesty in and the conception of modesty when you see humility in other chapters, and you won't get led astray. It's sort of nitpicky. It would be, you know, in a lot of respects, a lack of modesty on one's own part to be nitpicky about that when you're already given the tools for dealing with that intellectually. Now, she says modesty is something that's as equally distant from pride, or another word for pride is vanity, as it is from humility. And you may not realize this, but Wollstonecraft is actually playing out a set of distinctions that have been talked about in philosophy for a very long time. Aristotle discusses this in terms of the great-souled person. It becomes an issue that's discussed quite a bit for Christian thinkers, ranging from John Cassian to Anselm of Canterbury. It becomes an issue that's talked about by David Hume in the 18th century as well, somebody who Wollstonecraft is very familiar with. And Wollstonecraft is developing a position which, in certain respects, is mapping onto those other positions. She says that modesty is different than humility. She wants to insist on this. Why? She says that it's a soberness of mind which teaches a man not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. So there it starts to sound like humility. Don't think too highly of yourself. But you shouldn't think too lowly of yourself either. She says it should be distinguished from humility because humility is a kind of self-abasement. So the humble person actually treats themselves as having less value than they really do. It's a self-abasement, meaning one pushes oneself down, you know, bows down to somebody else. I'm not worthy, that sort of thing. So it's, in some respects, too little self-worth. And eventually it catches on and it becomes part of the mindset of the person. Now, there are a lot of people who are forced into situations in which they have to behave with what we're calling humility, not with modesty. Think about workplaces where people are forced to, suck up to bosses who are really, terrible people and have nothing to offer to the human race other than, being able to dole out jobs and yell at people. Think about marriages, think about relationships that are abusive, in which one person is constantly pushing the other person down, exploiting them, taking advantage of them, and in which the other person eventually comes to accept that point of view about themselves and to treat themselves as if they don't have any value. It takes a lot to work one's way out of that when it's become enracinated within one's mind and character. So with humility, one values oneself too little. With pride or vanity, one values oneself too much, more than one ought to. It could be on the basis of genuine qualities that a person has. For example, I play the banjo, and I'm not particularly good at it, and I don't actually do the sort of practicing that I should do in order to get good. So it would be really silly for me to say, I'm as good as Bella Fleck, who's this amazing banjo player who, not only can play, traditional music, but can play all sorts of contemporary stuff, has led bands, does concerts. That would be too much. If somebody came up to me and said, well, can you play at all? And I said, no, I can't play in public at all. Well, that'd be a little bit too little. Probably I should be more towards this end than this end. Now, notice one of the things that Wollstonecraft says is going to go along with this. And we'll come back to the modesty part in a moment. What happens when a person who's humble is offered the opportunity to do something? They beg off. They say, I can't do that. They're unwilling to undertake the sorts of things that they ought to be doing in order to advance themselves, in order to, help other people, in order to make the world a better place. They're unwilling to take a chance. People who are proud, on the other hand, or who are vain, way too willing to jump into things, and oftentimes they screw things up as a result. As a matter of fact, a lot of the problems that we have in human life human lives are caused by human beings who take on more than they are actually up to and screw it up, and then don't want to let anybody know that they screwed it up, and they have to cover it up, and it leads to bigger and bigger and bigger problems. And they're not able to say, yeah, I wasn't the man or the woman for the job. Modesty keeps us from doing that, because modesty tells us, just take on the stuff that you can actually do. Just take on the projects. Just commit yourself where you can actually do it. And this doesn't necessarily mean, curbing oneself back quite a bit. Like she says, it's compatible with a lofty consciousness. So she has some examples here. Milton was not arrogant when he suffered a suggestion of judgment to escaping that proved a prophecy. Think about what goes into creating great works. Milton wrote Paradise Lost. He also wrote a bunch of other things as well that are quite brilliant. If Milton had been humble, he wouldn't have done any of those sort of things. If Milton had been vain, he probably would have screwed it up. By being modest, he was actually able to create a great work of genius. General Washington. She says, nor was General Washington when he accepted the command of the American forces. The latter has always been characterized as a modest man. Had he been merely humble, he would have probably have shrunk back irresolute, afraid of trusting to himself the direction of an enterprise on which so much depended. It's modest people who you want to be the ones who you actually give power and authority to. Now notice how far away we are in talking about this from modesty conceived as this shrinking violet feminine virtue, which consists in like picking out the right kind of clothes with the hemlines not too high above the knee, or with too much showing. This is like worlds apart from the way that a lot of people in our own culture and in Wollstonecraft's culture were using this term modesty. It's really a matter of one's entire person in relation to other people. Let's go on and talk about something that she calls bashfulness. This is something that people often mistake for modesty, and she's got some really interesting things to say about it. She says, I don't mean to confound it with bashfulness. Bashfulness is so distinct from modesty that the most bashful lass or raw country lout often become the most impudent, for their bashfulness being merely the instinctive timidity of ignorance. Custom soon changes it into assurance. So when a person is bashful, they hang back not because they really have a just estimate of themselves. It's not coming from knowledge, it's actually coming from ignorance. Ignorance about where they fit in. So they're more prone to treat themselves as humble, and we can sort of draw an arc here that runs through bashfulness from humility to pride or vanity. As soon as they start to understand the situation that they're in and not to feel bashful, they become impudent as a result. They become like the prideful or vanity. And she gives an example with prostitution. She says the shameless behavior of the prostitutes may illustrate this remark. They trample on virgin bashfulness with a sort of bravado, and glorying in their shame, become more audaciously lewd than men, however depraved, to whom this sexual quality has not been gratuitously granted. But these poor ignorant wretches never had any modesty to lose when they consigned themselves to this, for modesty is a virtue, not a quality. They were only bashful innocents, and then once they lost their innocence, their shamefacedness was rudely brushed off. And she says something really interesting here. A virtue would have left some vestiges in the mind had it been sacrificed to passion to make us respect the grand ruin. But there's nothing like that left in this. And we could say the same thing about all sorts of other cases where somebody behaves in a bashful way, and then they start to figure out, the way things really work and how things are situated, and they launch over into this side of pride or vanity, which she's calling audacity. There's another thing that she talks about as well, as opposed to modesty. When she's talking about chastity, she says that chastity is not going to produce modesty, though it may produce propriety of conduct. But Modesty will, she says, heartily disclaim and refuse to dwell with that debauchery of mind which leads a man coolly to bring forward without a blush indecent allusions, obscene witticisms in the presence of a fellow creature. And then she says, how much more modest is the libertine who obeys the call of appetite or fancy than the lewd joker who sets the table in a roar. So she's saying, look, if you're going to be kind of obsessed with sex and trying to make an issue of it all the time, you're actually better off if you're the libertine, the player who's just trying to get sex, who's just trying to find a warm body to spend the night with, than being the kind of person who's constantly making lewd, rude allusions, who's telling dirty jokes, who's doing that sort of thing. She calls that a matter of immodesty or debauchery. And she has something really interesting to say about this a little bit further on. One reason why people would say that this sort of thing goes on is the sexes are involved in a state of warfare. And she says, well, to begin with, they're not really in a state of warfare, but if you want to use that sort of metaphor, if they're really to act that way, then let them act nobly. Or let pride whisper to them, the victory is mean when they merely vanquish sensibility. And she says, until men are more chaste, women are going to be immodest. Women are going to be engaging in this sort of stuff as well. Unless men, remember we've talked about this several times, men and women mutually improve each other or corrupt each other. If men can't actually develop modesty in this sense, then she says it's ridiculous to expect women to. Where indeed could modest women find husbands from whom they would not continually turn with disgust, she says. And here's a great line. Modesty must be equally cultivated by both sexes, or it will ever remain a sickly hothouse plant. Meaning something that you can only grow in a greenhouse, not something that can actually take the real world. So now I want to end with this by talking about why modesty is so particularly central and important for Wollstonecraft. She says that perhaps there is not a virtue that mixes so kindly with every other as modesty. It's the pale moonbeam that renders more interesting every virtue it softens, giving mild grandeur to the contracted horizon. So it's something that's needed in order for the other virtues to have the attractiveness that they have. A person who is courageous but is also proud or doesn't have the right assessment of themselves, not as attractive as a person who actually has a proper self-assessment of themselves, the courage that they have, and its relation to other people. So she says, the possession of virtue of any denomination is incompatible with ignorance and vanity. You must acquire soberness of mind, or you will remain in a doubtful, dependent situation. Here she's talking to women in particular and saying, if you actually want to acquire independence, you're going to have to cultivate this virtue of modesty, which is not the way it's been depicted to you, where it has to do with mere behavior, usually of a sexual nature, and more has to do with the entire character of a person.